Hey, everybody. On this episode of the Ethics Experts, we talk with Wesley Bizzell. He is a compliance lawyer and somebody who's really passionate about DE&I, and we get really deep into the intersection of both of those fields and wrap it up with some practical tips on how you can push your culture forward and really help to increase the level of belonging and inclusion that your workforce has. Hope you enjoy it. And by the way, we had some technical difficulties, so this was recorded in two parts. So you might notice a change in sound halfway through the episode. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie. Hope you're having an amazing day. You know, the world is a better place because you're in it. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So hit that subscribe button and join us as we change the world by making our workplaces better. I am here with Wesley Bizzell. He is the Senior Assistant General Counsel and Managing Director, and he's really focused on a lot of diversity and inclusion in the corporate and legal space. He's a thought leader, someone I've gotten to know over the last year or so, and pretty excited to have you on. How are you doing today, Wesley?
Great, doing well. Thank you so much.
So let's just dive right in. You have a lot of involvement in diversity and inclusion, and given your role, you have, I think, a lot of impact. And I'd like to hear a little bit about how you sort of got into this game and how you've seen the possibility for that impact to expand over the last, decade or so.
Yeah, so I think we are at really much an inflection point right now for DE&I issues. They're, clearly under attack by some segments of our community, and quite frankly, by the Supreme Court recent affirmative action cases. And so that is, I'm afraid, is going to continue to put challenges on DE&I initiatives and make, both companies and other organizations more hesitant than they've been. And I think that's a problem. I'm very saddened by that. If you look at the legal profession, the legal profession has not seen significant gains. They've been very incremental and minor, quite frankly, in terms of representation within law firms at the partner ranks. If you look at, sort of Black partners, it has inched up, 1 percentage point over the past about 10 years. And so, I think the concern is that there are going to be organizations that are scared away of, continuing diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. On the flip side, I think there's a lot of good that has occurred, but there's, also we haven't seen a ton of progress in various professions. Some are better than others. Some corporations and organizations are much better than others as well. But so that's where I'm sort of fearful of where we're going. How I got into it, I came out as gay and queer in law school, and had always been interested in DE&I issues. Before that, was part of a club in high school and college regarding that DE&I and diversity issues. And it was once I sort of expressed my true self and was comfortable and confident in being who I was openly and publicly, I decided that this was something that was certainly had been a passion of mine, and something where I could stand up and speak out and be an ally to people who don't look like me. And also support members of my community.
So you mentioned a little bit about, you're fearful about where we're going, and it's kind of puzzling to some degree to me that it seemed like, over the last, call it 5 years, there was like this tremendous sort of wave of like progress being made, and it seems like it's sort of like losing some of its footing right now. Where do you fear it might go? And what do you think we, me and you, all of us who care about this stuff, can do to kind of get it back on track and get that momentum back building forward?
Yeah, so I mean, just like a lot of other issues, I think that the focus on DE&I issues is a bit tidal. So it sort of ebbs and flows, and as to the movement forward, and then we backtrack and backslide in some cases. And I think that if you look at our history, that's certainly the case. So, you had the 60s, a tremendous amount of progress made on racial equity issues. The 70s and 80s, certainly not so much. And certainly in the 80s, I think we fell back in a lot of ways. And so I feel like that's where we are now. Again, we're sort of, the tide is, unfortunately going out in some areas. And I think that's why it's so important that people who care about these issues show up, that they let their concerns and their passion be known about DE&I issues, that they speak up, that they support leaders who are also passionate about this, and not just in the political sense, but in the corporate sense as well, and sort of empower others to step up in this space as well. Yeah. And so I think there's still a lot of opportunity for progress. I think there's still a lot of progress that certainly needs to be made, and people cannot and should not be frightened away from being an advocate for equity and inclusion issues. At the same time, I think that what we've seen is that the sort of concept of diversity has become weaponized, and I'm puzzled as to why that's gaining traction, I guess, but yeah. I'm not necessarily surprised if you look at again at the history of our country.
So that's interesting that you said that you're not surprised by it, because I actually am pretty surprised by it. And I guess I didn't think about kind of that progress made in the 60s, and then it sort of like kind of flattened out in the 80s, as you said. How like why are you not surprised by it? Just because it's happened before and like it just kind of swings like a pendulum?
It is, yeah. I think there's a lot of swinging like a pendulum. I think that we as a country, as a population, as a culture, are sort of get fixated on one thing and then lose interest in it very quickly. And so certainly with the murder of George Floyd and others, we fixated and focused on it as a country, as well we should. But now that we are several years out from that, it has lost the spotlight. Some of that's sort of a media issue. Some of that's, where it's no longer, on the news. And so it's no longer top of mind to people. I was in Minneapolis earlier this year for an American Bar Association diversity event, and stopped by George Floyd Square, wow. Which has now been named. And what was heartening was that there were still there were dozens and dozens of people there who were coming there to pay their respects, to remember there were people of all races and ethnicities there doing that. And so that's really the heartening. I think there still is a core group of people and probably a majority of people who really care about this issue and want us as a country to embrace and advance diversity, equity, inclusion. I think it's the minority that is speaking out loudly and louder than the majority here. I guess what I am surprised about is the velocity of the sort of backlash. So I'm not necessarily surprised about the backlash itself, but it really accelerated and has become very forceful in opposition, in the last 8 to 12 months, quite frankly. So it's very much, I don't think it's a grassroots type initiative. I think it's very much an organized initiative.
You do.
Designed to advance, agendas.
You think it's like politically based or something?
I think it is politically motivated. Maybe I'm optimistic enough to think that these people really, most of them who are behind this, don't have the opposition to diversity, equity, inclusion. They're just weaponizing it and utilizing it for their own gains.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying it's like a I don't know. They're sort of they're opportunistically sort of seizing this hotbed issue and sort of using it as a catalyst to sort of drive their own agenda forward. I guess that is sort of a relatively more sort of optimistic way to look at it versus it being like relatively more nefarious. Either way, the velocity change, to your point, is pretty startling. And
it is.
you know, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you going to George Floyd Square and just like what that was like and what impressions you were left with, you know, beyond the fact that you saw, okay, cool, there's this sort of core group there, but like what feelings did that evoke when you were there? Because it sounds like, you know, you prioritize going and visiting this site that was really, you know, again, sort of a launching point for the start of this movement as it sort of accelerated and picked up some speed.
Yes, I mean, I think so. I was, you know, in addition to being struck by sort of the diversity of people who were coming to honor and remember him and sort of, you know, be part of the fight against the oppression, the mementos and displays that were there were very touching. Some people had written letters. There were, you know, little teddy bears and other sort of little mementos set there in front of that convenience store. You know, I, you know, it is, you know, as with a lot of areas throughout this country, it's an economically, you know, disadvantaged area. And so you certainly see that in what's there and what's not there and sort of in that immediate neighborhood. But, you know, I hope, my hope is that we continue to remember and recognize the sort of the underlying issues that led to his murder and you know, the murder of so many others. And that is, I think, what, you know, all of us are sort of called to do, is sort of remember and recognize and, you know, and honor those that have gone before us in these struggles, but do more than that as well, is sort of take up that mantle and see what we can do to advance the cause.
You know, it's so crazy because there's this interesting corollary, I think, to, you know, like an organization, and we play in this sort of corporate integrity space, and a lot of the compliance folks, you know, the ethics folks that we talk to, you know, there's like this bell curve within an organization, right? And you have people on one end who are just your sociopaths who are never going to do the right thing, right? And then you have the people on the other end, that other sort of 3 to 5% in your organization that are always going to do the right thing regardless of the cost, right? They will speak up. These are your, you know, classic whistleblowers who are going to stand for, you know, they're standing on principles and they're going to, you know, speak up on something regardless of the cost, right? And then you have this massive amount in the middle, call it 90% of the organization. And, you know, we always talk about, like, the battleground is not the 3% or 5% of sociopaths on the bottom. The battleground is that 90% in the middle, and getting those people engaged. And I kind of see kind of a parallel with this whole DE&I thing, because when it's top of mind and when it's in the headlines, you have all these, you know, people in the middle who are like championing it and, you know, engaged in it. But then, as you said, as sort of time passes and it sort of starts to drift down further on the, you know, on the headlines, or it's not showing up in your, you know, your Instagram feed as much, those folks get kind of disengaged. You still have those core folks like you or others who are so committed to this, you know, they want to leave the world better. They want to fight against the sort of, you know, the oppression that's still present in our society. But like, what do we do about that 90% in the middle? And how do we, you know, avoid engaging them, you know, without there being another sort of tragedy? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I sort of call that the mushy middle, right? And
yeah.
People who may not see these issues on a daily basis, and certainly don't experience them on a daily basis. So I think part of the challenge is, you know, is a little bit of education and sort of empathy awareness of, you know, making them understand what someone who doesn't look like them goes through on a daily basis. You know, as a white cis man, I can, you know, walk into, you know, pretty much any store and never comes to mind that someone's going to follow me around, right, because I don't sort of fit in to, you know, whatever demographic they think should be coming into that store, right? And so it's sort of opening up people's eyes to that. We were at a corporate diversity event a number of years ago, and one of my Black colleagues said, you as a white person don't have to sit your teenage children down as they're learning to drive and say, here's what you need to do when a police officer pulls you over. Not if a police officer pulls you over, when, right? And, it's, that no sudden movements, both hands on the wheel, don't talk back, because, history shows us that there are, deadly and severe consequences that happen when a young Black man usually is pulled over and for generally pretextual reasons, and the sort of gasps in the room when my colleague said that, because it hadn't even dawned on people. I part of the struggle, the thing that we need to overcome is in a lot of ways we are still very much a segregated society, and so people don't often see outside the bubble in which they live, and that is what we have to do is we have to show people what life is like for someone who doesn't look like them. A straight couple probably never has a moment where they're like, should we hold hands out here in public?
Yeah.
But, that thought has run through my mind thousands and thousands of times. And not just in sort of, small rural areas and big cities as well. Because, we know that while, urban centers are certainly more diverse and tend to be, more welcoming, that doesn't mean that they're completely safe at the same time. And that is, I think that is true for every marginalized community, is you can feel a sense of comfort, but there's always a little bit of edge that you're worried about. And so it's showing people experiences that they don't have to deal with on a daily basis, and having them understand that. And I think the more people understand these issues, I think the greater empathy we get, and the number of people who are, more committed to it. And I think that's, part of why George Floyd's murder and the video surrounding it and the media surrounding it was so powerful, is because there was a documented moment of something that was occurring, real and tragic and abhorrent, that was a side of the world that a lot of people in our nation, never envisioned, never thought about, never crossed their minds. And so that one video, opened up their eyes. And, like you said, I think the issue is that keeping it top of mind.
Right.
And it can't be a situation that was like, in 5 years, people like George Floyd. I don't remember, the name sounds familiar, but I don't remember what happened there really. We've got to, find a way to sort of harness that energy when it comes, and push it forward. And I think, creating these eye-opening, empathetic moments, which don't have to revolve around tragedy, but do have to revolve around human connection. Quite frankly, it's understanding and interacting with someone who doesn't share the characteristics that you have.
Yeah, something you said is pretty interesting. You said it doesn't have to necessarily be a tragedy, but it has to spark that feeling. And I think that's spot on. I think logic makes you think. You can describe something 100 different ways and someone will sort of sit back and say, oh, that makes sense. Logic makes you think, but emotion makes you act. And I think we saw a lot of action when that sort of broad righteous indignation was sort of sparked across our country, But then to your point, it's like, if there's not sort of a perpetual motion behind it and a perpetual push, then it just kind of fizzles out, and that mushy middle just starts to be a mushy middle again. It's kind of frustrating.
It is, and I think what we've seen with the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement is that that once people realized they knew someone who was queer or who was part of the LGBTQ plus community, their feelings and emotions and perceptions changed. So, I think what we see now and for our trans siblings is that part of the challenge is that a lot of people don't think that they have ever met a trans person, and so they haven't created that human connection with someone who is different from them, who is trans. The reality is in many cases, they probably have met someone who's trans. They just don't know it. And that was sort of the case with the LGBTQ plus community, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, is that we were out there. We were all, people were mostly closeted and they, it was sort of this silent and invisible minority that people didn't think they knew. And once they got to realize that, my brother's best friend or my sister or, my uncle is LGBTQ plus, then they started becoming more empathetic to the issues. And that's partly why I think why marriage equality took off and advanced so rapidly. Was because people saw LGBTQ plus people in their lives and were more empathetic and understanding and supportive of them. And we've got to, I think, create those moments. And I think corporations and organizations have a lot of opportunity to do that. We spend most of our days at work, right? And so I think organizations can help benefit greater society by creating these opportunities to better interact with folks who aren't like us.
Yeah, I think when you see somebody or you're kind of around somebody who's not like you, you can, to your point, automatically see the humanity in them and at least connect and say, okay, well, this is another human being and they're going through the same things that I'm going through at some level. You mentioned early in the conversation that you're fearful that you're fearful of where we're potentially going in terms of some of the headwinds that we're seeing, and that organizations might be sort of scared to continue to sort of push the ball forward. How do you see that happening? And or what do you think the average organization can do to help drive more progress?
So I think we're seeing a lot currently right now of, and certainly in the past couple of weeks, targeted lawsuits against companies and law firms and other organizations that are keying off of the Harvard Supreme Court decision, and basically saying because of that Supreme Court decision regarding affirmative action, you as an entity shouldn't be engaging in diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives.
But wasn't that ruling, wasn't that really just about the education space?
It was. It definitely was. But they're trying to take it. These opponents are trying to take it a step further. You had United States senators send letters to a couple hundred law firms and companies, basically saying you are under the microscope right now. That from a personal perspective saddens me for a number of occasions and a number of reasons, including the fact that U.S. senator sits in the seat of a United States senator that I worked for 20 years ago.
Oh, really?
Who was a champion of diversity, equity, inclusion issues.
Isn't that crazy?
And so the politics of my home state has flipped dramatically since I was a Capitol Hill staffer and supporting the United States senator, the senators that I worked for. But so it's what I think you're seeing is that they're trying to intimidate and leverage this Supreme Court decision, even though it doesn't mesh up on employment issues, because it was all about sort of the educational space and what schools can do to attract diverse talent, diverse students.
So there's some debate, though, at least in the current zeitgeist, about is there actual value in more diversity? And so you've sort of, I think you would say that there's a lot of statistical, verifiable, objective evidence out there that supports that.
That's right. I mean, I think if you look at the studies that have been done, and from a more practical aspect, if you ask any CEO, they will tell you from their own personal lived experience that diverse teams produce better outcomes. Companies, the studies show that companies with greater levels of diversity are more profitable. They are more likely to have better engagement scores within their employee population.
Right.
And employees tend to be more productive in diverse organizations as well.
This topic has gotten so much attention over the last, I don't know, how long do you think? 10 years, 5 years, something like that. It seems to have gone parabolic, but I think we can see signs of this truth a long time ago. In our pre-show, we were talking about this Coca-Cola ad. Tell us about that ad and how that kind of exhibits this,
Sure. I think, companies had a greater and more pronounced focus on diversity, equity, inclusion issues, following the murder of George Floyd in 2020. But that's not to say also that companies haven't been focused on this. I think you have more companies focused on it since 2020. But there were always vanguards and leaders in, the top of corporate America that took these issues to heart and, invested in them and cared about them. And so, we see it, dating back, in the 50s and 60s where, companies were, integrating their workforce. My company integrated its workforce in the 1930s.
Wow.
And its manufacturing workforce in Richmond, Virginia. And Coca-Cola has this really amazing ad campaign from the 1960s, which they called Boys on a Bench. And it is a group of teenagers. It's a group of black and white teenage boys who are sitting on this bench. But if you look closely, there is a railing down the exact center of the bench. And that was known as a segregation bench. And the boys are interspersed racially along the bench. And it was an ad campaign. It was really a statement about Coca-Cola and its, views of diversity, its views on segregation. And it was subtle, but it was a very effective, and it's become an iconic campaign. And if your listeners haven't seen it, I would certainly suggest they Google Boys on a Bench and Coca-Cola and learn the history of it. It's a really iconic photo and ad.
I mean, think about that. How crazy that you have a segregated bench. There's just some arbitrary divider on the bench. I mean, it's so nuts. What do you think what is an equivalent of that today? That we look back, what is that, 50, 70 years, right? Whatever, 50, 60 years. And we're that seems so insane. That's nuts. What do you think 50 years from now, guys are going to be looking back and saying that's crazy? What is the equivalent for today, you think?
So I think there's many examples. I think we haven't solved racial inequity problems in our country. So I think people will continue to look back and say, I can't believe we were having debates about diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2023 and 2024, right? I think that there's a lot regarding the LGBTQ plus community as well, and specifically the trans community. So the trans community is under legislative attack. There were more than 500 different anti-LGBTQ plus bills introduced in state legislatures last year.
Wow.
The vast majority of those were targeting trans individuals and trans young people. And so I think, my hope is that, as Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe, bends towards justice. I hope we will continue to bend towards that justice. and that our future will see greater strides, continued strides on racial equity issues, on LGBTQ plus issues, on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in general. I think right now we are certainly seeing a backlash, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like
both. Yeah,
it's like a little bit of progress and then back, 2 steps, 1 step. You know what I mean?
and that's I think that is his historic act is accurately in a historic way as well, as accurate in a historic way, and so we saw that in the 1960s and 70s. We saw that in the 1980s on LGBTQ plus issues, and the marriage bans in the 1990s. So I think there's always our American culture has always been a little bit of a, we will give you greater equity and equitable treatment, but we're going to take some things back.
Yeah.
After a while
yeah, a little horse trading, So
it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. And it's obviously not monolithic. There's all these little, decisions and conflicts and, marginal choices that are made that kind of that cause us to wind up where we're at. I'd like to talk a little bit about, you work at an organization that, as you said, integrated its workforce in the 1930s, which was probably one of the first ever. I mean, that's, especially in Virginia, that's wild, right? So you're in an organization that I would say, I'm sure it has flaws and all that stuff, but like that kind of gets it. And so my question is, have you worked in another organization that isn't as sort of forward thinking as your current organization? And like, how does that feel? Like, I'd like to hear a little bit about what that dichotomy is and like how that actually, we can talk about kind of what those differences are and so forth, but like, how have you seen it? Like, what benefits have you seen from this more forward thinking organization that you're in?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of benefits. I think, it is much easier to recruit employees. Younger employees look at, and we know this is the case from both research into it in general, but also interviews that they do with millennials and Gen Zs who are when they're entering the workforce, like, what are you looking for? And they a lot of them report that they are looking for an organization that reflects their personal values on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues.
Right.
And there was a recent study that showed among LGBTQ plus workers that over 70% do research into a company's website and social media to see how inclusive it is before they apply for a job there. I think that came from the job site Indeed. And so there's a lot of pre-screening that goes on by employees who are looking for new jobs or entering the workforce, and screening out if they don't think the values line up. And so companies lose talent that way. And so we have certainly seen, and others certainly as well have seen better talent coming in because and people who self-report that I may have not considered you otherwise for being my employer, but then I found out about this part of the company that you do, these types of activities that you engage in.
Yeah, there's this kind of interesting corollary between like the general sales process that exists today versus how it existed in the past, and the same thing you're talking about. And what it kind of comes down to is kind of information asymmetry. So if you think back, this sort of quintessential used car lot, you show up, the guy's got the slick hair and the polyester suit. There was a tremendous amount of information asymmetry in that transaction because they knew the car, you didn't. Well, today, there's been sort of a leveling where you can go and get the Carfax and you can check the VIN number and you can see what other cars of that model and that color in your zip code have sold for. So now you can come in with a much more level playing field. And I think a lot of organizations don't appreciate this information asymmetry shift that's happened. And I think there's a lot of different, to what you were saying, this digital footprint that each of us has, that each organization has to an even greater degree, leaves a lot of breadcrumbs for people to investigate. And people are going to do that diligence because they're doing it on every other purchase they make. They're purchasing a job to some degree, right? They're giving their allegiance to an organization, at least for some period of time. They're doing those same motions, you know what I'm saying? To your point, they're going on Glassdoor, they're reaching out to other people, they're looking at, people who left the organization on LinkedIn and so forth. And I think a lot of organizations, I'd love your reaction to this, but I think a lot of organizations, maybe there's a few different phases. There's like the first phase where they're just totally blind to it, they don't care about it. There's the second phase where they're like, okay, we have to do something about it, but it's not really authentic, it hasn't sort of seeped into the bones of the company. There, I think we really run the risk of like this, inclusivity greenwashing. And then you have sort of the top of the mountain, so to speak, of an organization that really embraces it and really tries to live it out. And while it's not perfect, they're taking sort of tangible steps that the employee base sees to close that gap. You know what I mean? What do you think about that framework, and like, where do you think we are kind of on that, and on a really high level? Like, where do you think most organizations are on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a really good way to think about it because, I think most, certainly large, we're a Fortune 200 company. So, most large Fortune 500 companies, are somewhere on that journey. I think I think most of them, the vast majority, I would assume and hope are, have moved beyond that first step of ignoring it and sort of either kicking things off or well on the journey of sort of being a truly inclusive and workplace. I think there's a minority, and I think it will always exist, of companies that are only care about the window dressing aspect of it. And like you said, the talent, the job talent, is going to vote with their feet. They're either, and so that once the companies sort of get caught at what they're doing and it becomes known, they're going to have to change the tactics that they're using because it's not going to be sustainable for them to sort of have this window dressing and try to attract top talent.
Yeah.
And so, I think the real differential is, and I've certainly seen it in a number of workplaces, is where these types of issues, inclusion, diversity, equity issues, rise to the level of the C-suite and particularly the CEO. There is much more focus from a cultural perspective on the issues than if it's just housed in your HR department or your chief, even if you have a chief diversity officer. If it's the role of the chief diversity officer and only the chief diversity officer to care about diversity, your company is not going to be as sort of mindful on these issues compared to a company where the CEO and their entire leadership team is involved and cares about it. And so, I'm blessed to work for an organization where the CEO has, devoted a lot of time and energy to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues and cares personally about it and professionally about it. Mm-hmm. And so, but I've seen, organizations that I've been involved in where other CEOs didn't. And there's a dramatic shift. I think what hopefully happens is because, employees change and CEOs change. From a global perspective is once you have a couple of iterations of CEOs who have embraced this, those who come after them have no choice but to embrace it as well, because the culture has been set and the expectation from an employee base has been set.
And presumably the benefit has been experienced to reinforce that motion. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And so that will allow for further growth and further movement in the years to come.
Yeah, I think, 20 years from now, the shape of this conversation is likely going to be very different. I think our opportunity as, leaders in businesses right now is how do we get to where we would otherwise be 20 years from now, 5 years from now? Like, how do we compress that time? How do we pull that stuff forward and make more progress beyond the natural tailwinds that are just going to push us toward this as CEOs turn over and as the workforce turns over and more of these light bulbs turn on? You know what I mean? If you were thinking, though, about like advice to provide somebody who's working in an organization that maybe is not on the the fully actualized side of the spectrum that we just sort of established, what advice would you give them? Is it a question of convincing executives? Is it a question of starting local? Is it a question of finding studies that like reinforce this thing? How would you go about it? 'Cause I know that that's like a very hard question, and maybe it's a stupid question, but I always like to try to give someone like something that they can actually do to like change their world a little. You know what I mean?
Exactly. No, I think I'm all about practical advice as well. So I appreciate the question. I think there's multiple ways to look at it, and someone has to look at sort of where their sphere of influence is, and work through that. But they can also look for opportunities to sort of raise it to higher levels as well. And so,
okay.
What I tell a lot of people on these issues is that, look, you may think as like a brand new hire, fresh out of college, this is your first job, this is your first year of employment in a professional environment, that like you have zero influence. But that's not true. You have a perspective that is more than the interns that that are in your company, for instance, or more than the person who was hired 8 months after you, 12 months after you. And so you can change the culture in how you interact with people, and you can, advocate to others. And so, there was a great example in my company where a number of years ago, I was one of the founders of our LGBTQ plus ERG and was one of its leaders. And an employee came to me and said, "Hey, I'm trying to start a family through surrogacy. And did you know our health insurance policy doesn't cover surrogacy for same-sex couples?" And this is as I had adopted my son years ago, and wasn't aware of even before I came to the company, and so I wasn't sort of aware of how the health benefits dealt with family planning for my company, other than I knew that we had some kind of adoption benefits. And so we and the other leaders, I and the other leaders of the ERG sort of looked into it. It apparently is a very common thing among health plans not to cover fertility treatment or surrogacy for same-sex couples.
In particular.
And in particular, well, for the application is to same-sex couples. The reality is the way it's addressed is that the provision of that benefit only applies if you are deemed to be medically infertile.
Got you. Interesting. So by de facto, then.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, so that one conversation, this employee who was pretty new to the organization, I didn't know him all that well, came up to me and sort of was a, "Hey, did you know?" Conversation, and this is sort of a disappointing place to be at. It kicked off a campaign internally where we did some benchmarking. I worked with our HR department, and we came to a point of creating a new benefit where we would provide up to $35,000 in reimbursement for adoption or surrogacy. That's not the perfect solution to the plan, but when you're dealing with a healthcare plan, it's a little hard to sort of change the plan itself. And so we sort of looked for an alternative. But so that's just an example of how someone can, raise an issue with someone who's more senior to them and encourage them to look into it or to push it forward and really sort of change the culture of an organization. I think there's ways, big and small, that folks can do that. They can, do it in their own small teams. And, if the company is not talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they can say, hey, at our, we all have weekly meetings or monthly meetings with our teams, an all-in meeting, and say, hey, can we add an agenda item? I'm happy to take on the work to do it, to add an agenda item to do a little bit of education on cultural competency, for instance. And and that can sort of
who would say no to that? Of course someone would.
And that can grow outside the team, and others will see that it's being done. And so even if you don't think that, I am 12 or 20 people removed from the CEO from a title perspective, from an org chart perspective, and there was no way I'm going to be able to change the culture of the company. There are ways to do it within your own team, and then it can grow. And then there's ways to sort of elevate issues where the CEO signs off and says, yes, we want to do that benefit.
Well, there's so much in that story, and I promise to all the listeners that we did not coordinate this. What a great example of what we're talking about. There's just so much in it. Somebody felt safe enough to come to someone a higher level to raise this issue. They themselves were willing to speak up about this issue and look at the change that it drove. And I think that's really what the answer is. You have to have the high agency mindset, and you have to be, you have to push for that change you want to see in the world. It starts with trying to be that change, not to be too cliche about it all, but you have to be that change, and you have to push for that change because, I don't know, I don't think everybody is nefarious. I just think people are, maybe not thoughtful, or they're overwhelmed with their life or whatever. And maybe nobody thought about the implication of that plan when that was selected. You know what I'm saying? But this is a great example again of all this stuff can be moved. All this stuff can be tweaked, and there can be a new policy, and there can be a new, there can be a new benefit created or something, but it's not going to naturally happen. We have to do something to make that happen,
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of the analogy of the pebble in the pond. So you throw in those concentric circles, and you sort of influence the circle around you, and that influences the circle around them, and by that you sort of change a culture and a practice.
Yeah.
And I think it does sometimes. Yeah, it does take a little bit of courage. It will always take some amount of courage to step up and raise an issue, raise a concern, but what would have happened if this employee hadn't done that, and how many people have benefited because he had that personal experience and wasn't just going to sort of grouse in the corner and be like, I can't believe this. He's like, I'm going to tell someone about it.
Yeah. Good on him for doing that, because how does that not fester? That feels like something, I'm sure that to him that felt like an injustice. And how can that not fester? How can that not be some cognitive dissonance for the picture that he had of the organization, or what he was told about the organization's commitment to this concept, and what his individual lived experience is? Those are two totally different things, I'm going to sound like an idiot here, so buckle up. Anybody who listens to this knows that. But when this movement started, I'm going to probably get this wrong, but I just would love some insight and some education, because when the movement started, it was really, I think, diversity and inclusion, and then it turned to DEI, and then we have a webinar coming up in a week or two that's DEIB, right? We've included belonging in that, and I would just, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear kind of the shape of that transition and what those additional acronym, or those additional letters in the acronym, are meant to represent, and why that's important. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, yeah. So it is, a lot of people. You will see in a lot of what normally were chief diversity officers are now chief DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging officers. That is true. So I think at first, and sort of dating back to the 1960s, really, people were looking at sort of the group of individuals that they had as employees, and noticing that they mostly all looked alike. They were mostly all white, straight men. And certainly at the highest levels of the organization, they were almost always. And that, has not changed tremendously in the, 60 years since, but it has changed a little bit. And so the original focus was on, let's get more people who don't look like us into the organization. And what I think corporate America was a little slow to on the uptake here was not realizing that, you can bring in diverse people, but they're not staying if they don't feel welcomed in your organization.
Okay.
And you can, there's always ways to, entice diverse people into your organization to come as an employee, whether it's, benefits or salary or what have you, or, false promises in some cases. But when they realize that the culture is not supportive of them as an individual, they're not going to stick around. They'll stick around for the amount of time that it's necessary for them to get what they need out of the job, right? Whether it's the experience, the contacts, whatever it might be, we'll stick around. Many of us will, but we're not gonna be sort of committed to the organization itself. And so that's sort of where the inclusion started coming in. Is we need to sort of change the culture to be more inclusive, to recognize that people are different, and that we can't have this sort of monolithic view of what our employee should act like or be like or dress, look like. And so that was sort of the next iteration. I think where we are now with belonging is, what makes people sort of, where is this the stickiness of that employee relationship? What makes people really stay within the company for a length of time that's beneficial? Because it's expensive to go out and hire a new employee. It's expensive to retrain someone for a position where someone else has left. And so the companies have realized that you need to not just have an inclusive culture, but you need to have a culture where that employee feels connected to the company and to the work that they are doing, and to the culture of the company. Because we're spending, most of us are spending well in north of 40 hours a week in our corporate lives, and in order for us to feel good about what we're doing, I think we do need to feel that connection. And I think we have seen in sort of a post-COVID environment, those companies that were well along the path on belonging were better able to retain their talent when you're not physically in the office. There's some psychological benefit of coming together for corporate employees, and from an organizational perspective, whether it's just that sort of camaraderie and friendship, or something greater than that. But when we weren't able to do that, and we were just connecting via a camera, the people who were sticking around their jobs, not because of necessarily the culture of the organization, but the relationships with the people they worked for. And when those relationships sort of, they weren't severed entirely, but they were pulled apart in a lot of ways, because you're not face to face anymore. People were like, well, maybe I should look for another job. But if you look at those companies that were scoring well on sort of these belonging indexes, and these other sort of indices that look at sort of the corporate culture around these types of things, you'll see that the retention was greater in those companies.
Yeah, I guess when you have that belonging, there's more sort of threads tying you to the company. Those threads are kind of like relationships, their impact that you feel like you're having, it's fulfillment from the job. As you're describing this, I'm just kind of like trying to step out of it and think about this like debate that's swirling around these these initials. And it's sort of inarguable to me that in a knowledge work economy, that belonging is critical. It's obviously critical. Inclusion is obviously critical. I mean, again, we're not just standing on a production line, pulling a lever and pressing a button.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like, we're putting so much of ourselves into our work, regardless of what you're doing in this knowledge work economy, right? So that kind of talks about the belonging piece. The inclusion piece, I mean, my friend Mita wrote this really cool book, Rethinking Inclusion. And, she kind of summed up inclusion really well. She was like, think back to junior high kickball, how you felt being picked last. That's what no inclusion feels like, right? So, okay, I just can't imagine a leader who thinks like, I don't want people to feel included in my company. I don't want people to feel belonging in my company. And yet there's this like dissonance around this topic. And, getting back to that spectrum I was talking about of those three different buckets, ignoring it, kind of paying lip service or window dressing as you called it, or, actually fully engaged. I saw a TikTok maybe a week ago, and it was a black woman, and she, the thing said, how you were just a diversity hire, and she was apparently the DE&I, the head of DE&I in the organization, and it was a really I kind of felt for her because the things that were popping up on the screen, we've all seen TikToks, of course. It was like they want you for every picture. They want your face out there, but you're never in any meetings. And you're never in any meetings when the decisions are made. And I'm kind of like botching the conveyance of the feeling of the TikTok, but you could feel the frustration that she had. And this is a well-intending person, obviously, that wanted to go and make a difference in an organization, and she seemed to be kind of stuck in that sort of middle bucket. You know what I mean? How do we reframe this department or this function for it not to be myopically viewed, but rather seen more holistically as the underpinnings and as the formalization for what it takes for a knowledge work organization to be successful?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question, quite certainly. And, I think a couple things, it takes, the leadership outside that chief diversity officer, showing up and speaking up about it. So my day job is in compliance. So I'm a compliance lawyer, and we talk in compliance a lot about tone at the top. And and that means, if the top of the house, if the CEO is talking about behaving ethically and legally, that permeates down through the organization. I think that's very true of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging issues, is where, it takes that CEO incorporating it and weaving it into, the broader conversations, the town halls, whatever it may be, communications that the CEO has with employees, both, on a large basis and on individual basis. And then people are like, this is something that our company's cares about. This is something that it's important enough. It takes that, I would also say that, the corporate boards have a role in this as well. Boards of directors of these Fortune 500 companies, they can ask and can, say, hey, I want a briefing on this. I want to understand better what we're doing on these issues. And so the more the top of the house focuses on it, the more everybody else focuses on it. And the more the top of the house ignores it, everyone else ignores it. And you have the situation like you just talked about, is where it's like, well, we'll shunt it off to this role that we will have for show, essentially, not give that person any support, not give them any validity, and sort of function, true function and true ability to impact change. We will, just give them a title and sort of let them dabble and see what happens, but not do anything to help them out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a frustrating spot because then it sends such a message to the broader organization that clearly that endorsement's not there. And it sends this, and then it sort of reinforces the sort of negative thing that everybody kind of has in them to like kind of poke fun. And you have this, this person with their wings sort of clipped. I don't know, man, this is such a, I love this kind of intersection of compliance and ethics and DE&I and we're really just kind of talking about a culture, and we're talking about the environment that somebody feels as they're working inside of an organization. And there's so many intersection points between compliance and ethics and culture and DEI and so forth. And you have a really unique perspective, and I just really enjoyed the conversation. Glad we were able to reconnect. Before we wrap up, though, if you could go back in time and find a young Wesley and give him some advice you wish you got earlier, what would that be?
Oh, gosh. I think it would be, don't be afraid to find your voice and to speak up. And then coupled with that is that, always understand that, that relationships are key. I think everything we do in a corporate environment relies on the relationship that we have with other people and how we are perceived as well. But if someone's much more likely to trust you if they've had other interactions with you, right? And the conversation is just going to flow a little better than if you show up and you've never talked to that person. You have to either have a tough conversation with them or have to work with them on an issue. And that's always certainly going to be that way. There's always going to be new people coming into your life, but looking at it and not from a way of sort of self absorption or something where only benefits you, but looking and seeing what relationships can I develop that may not have a personal benefit for me now, but can be helpful sort of down the road and sort of expanding that network. And I think that's true with any type of organization that you're in, because once I was lucky in sort of the example we talked about earlier of the benefits. I had worked with the benefits, our vice president of benefits before, and so I could say, "Hey, can we have a conversation about this?" And he knew me well enough to know that this was a serious issue, that I was committed to it and would help him with it, versus me coming to him cold and asking for a change. It would have been a much harder sort of rock to lift, if you will, in that situation.
Yeah. Hey, great to meet you. How about 35K? You know what I mean? That's not going to go that well, That's such good advice. And, as you were saying that, I was just kind of thinking, what we're really talking about is a posture, and what we're talking about is a way that we move through the world. It's not like you're doing calculus on every single person you interact with to say, like, how could this potentially benefit me in the future? No, you're trying to build relationships with everybody, and you're trying to, expand that sort of influence and that exposure and all that kind of stuff. And it's such an easier way to go through the world, focusing on others versus focusing on self, I think, because otherwise, if you're focusing on self, you're constantly doing that arithmetic to say, like, is this person worth my time? And this is a human being, you know what I'm saying? So really great advice, man. This was a lot of fun. Would love to do something again in the future, but thank you so much for joining us, and Happy New Year. You're kicking off 2024, imagine.
Hard to believe we're there.
Exactly. See you next time.